Clair Obscur Expedition 33 is a turn-based JRPG-inspired game with an extremely weird title that has a Metacritic score in the 90s and a somber piano piece as its theme on the home screen. Now, I could stop right there and you'd already know it's a banger, but where would be the fun in that? I know I'm late to the party on this one, but man, I just couldn't help myself. I really wanted to make some kind of content about this game, even if I'm just repeating the public consensus. I'll give a moderate spoiler warning right off the bat. I'll be showing enemy and boss designs from the mid to late game throughout, just to illustrate some of my points, so play the game for yourself if you don't want to see that stuff. We'll also have a section later on where I go into narrative spoilers, and I'll give a second warning when we get there. And whether you decide to watch this video or not, please play this game. It's very rare to see a game that does so many things as well as this one does. Usually when we're talking about games, even great ones, we have to make caveats. The combat is great, but the story is mid. The story is great, but the gameplay sucks. Not the case with Expedition 33. The combat is great. The story is engaging from the very beginning. The characters and character writing are great. The music slaps, and the art direction is some of the best I've seen in any game. It's crazy how many areas this game excels in. This game is worth considering even for players who typically aren't a fan of this style. Expedition 33 breaks many JRPG conventions. However, it's still clear that the game was made with a lot of respect for the genre. It absolutely has Final Fantasy in its DNA, but I ended up enjoying it a lot more than any Final Fantasy I've ever played, and a lot of that has to do with how fun the combat is. Clair Obscur is hardly the first turn-based game to incorporate reaction-based elements into its combat. The Mario RPGs are the first ones that come to mind, but these mechanics were implemented exceptionally well. Usually in turn-based RPGs, it's all about strategy, and much of the battle is decided by how well you've built your characters beforehand. Expedition 33 certainly has that too, but every encounter is 100% winnable no matter what. All damage can be avoided by either dodging or parrying. Dodging is easier, but parrying every attack allows for a counter to be performed. This system basically solves my biggest pet peeves of turn-based combat. I don't like it when some battles are mathematically impossible to win, or when luck is a significant factor in determining how well my characters fight. Taking damage is usually an inevitability. Sure, there are usually means of mitigating damage with defensive buffs and whatnot, but a lot of the time it feels like all I can do is sit there with my thumb up my ass and hope for the best. Even in good or sometimes great RPGs, I get frustrated due to bad RNG. In Expedition 33, this is not the case. Due to the real-time reaction-based mechanics, defensive play is both fun and engaging. During the enemy's turn is when you have to be the most locked in. You have to decide whether or not it's worth it to risk parrying. The parry timing is lenient enough for it to be viable, and there are a plethora of passive perks that can increase the value of parrying in general, but strict enough so as to not remove too much tension from the encounters. The attack patterns also get increasingly more elaborate as the game goes on, creating a sense of progression that goes beyond just seeing higher numbers on the screen. The developers also did a great job of communicating the correct dodge and parry timings. There are visual and audio cues present, which make the attack patterns intuitive to learn and rarely ever frustrating. For example, one of the first enemies in the game has a delayed lance attack. Right before it lands, the enemy moves his shoulder back a bit. Another example, this enemy way later into the game has a lengthy sword combo. Right before each hit, there's a little click sound, so I know to press the parry button right after hearing it. It's like a rhythm game. There are things like this everywhere, and they help the combat feel reaction-based. It's not pure memorization, though there is some of that with certain attacks. For me, it was an acceptable amount. Not every attack timing is intuitive, but for the most part they did a really good job. The game also adds more defensive reactions as the game progresses in the form of jumps and gradient counters, which come with their own special telegraphs and are also fun to perform. I played on expert difficulty, and I'm very glad that I did. It made the encounters so much more engaging, knowing that the punishment for mistiming something was so severe. Expedition 33 took my least favorite part of turn-based combat and turned it into something beautiful. The offensive mechanics are also quite good, and a significant break from JRPG convention, Clair Obscur has no traditional magic system. Instead, characters always start battles with the same amount of AP. AP is earned by performing basic attacks. It's possible to increase the starting amount, as well as how much AP your characters will yield with their attacks, but point is, AP is not a resource the game expects you to manage outside of battle. The game doesn't have any meaningful resource management for that matter, but I'll get more into that when we talk about level design. Every character in this game works differently, and they usually require some strategizing to be used effectively. You have to have an idea of the order in which to use skills. Mael's gameplay involves switching between offensive, defensive, and virtuose stances, the last of which allows her to deal 200% damage. You can build her as a tank if you want, but I mean, come on, that's 200% damage. I'm going for that as often as possible. But you still have to perform the right combination of skills to get into the virtuoso stance. It can take her a while to get going, but man, her damage can be downright disgusting if you play her right, and late game Pictos can help her reach her full damage potential faster, so she was a useful party member throughout. Lune operates by creating elemental stains with each spell she casts. She can then slurp them up to increase the damage output, among other positive effects. Thermal Transfer might be the most overpowered ability in the game, or at least the most broken skill that I came across. If the enemy is burning, she can play a second turn after using it with no downside, and if she consumed the elemental stains, she gains 4 AP. As long as the enemy was burning, she essentially had an infinite supply of AP, which meant that I could spam her most powerful spells over and over again. I think this move got patched in the middle of my playthrough though, it's nowhere near as broken now, and I actually used her a lot less because of it. Regardless, I like the fact that you can choose whether to make her more of a healer, damage cannon, or a little bit of both. CL works by applying and consuming Foretell. The more Foretell she applies, the better her skills work. Playing her well requires knowing the right moment to cash in. She can also play more of a supporting role by harvesting either HP or AP or doubling someone's damage. Her damage output can also be quite disgusting due to her Twilight mechanic, which increases Foretell and overall damage. Verso is another damage cannon with a ranking system built into his gameplay. Basically, the more damage he deals, the higher his rank. He can increase his rank even further by parrying, but it'll go down if he takes damage. Certain skills will work better at certain ranks, so there is some strategy involved, but he's mostly there to just hit things really hard. I got this weapon for him in Act 3 that starts him off in S rank and improves his damage if he doesn't get hit, at the cost of not being able to recover health. The trade-off was so worth it though. His damage was so high after obtaining this that he almost never left my party for the rest of the game. Stack him with Lumina like Immaculate, Warming Up, Confident Fighter, and he was an absolute beast. Good for my playstyle too, because I'm all about those parries. As long as I could avoid damage, he was a monster. Minoko was initially my least favorite character since I found it harder to strategize around his wheel. Its starting position is random, or at least it might as well be random because I couldn't figure out the pattern to it. Anyways, the wheel affects the potency of his skills, but you have to use his skills to turn the wheel. I found it hard to get the effects I wanted without spending a ton of AP trying to move the wheel around. But once I found the weapon that spins the wheel after a free aim shot, he became a lot more fun to use. And now I could just shoot the enemy until I got the mask I wanted and farm AP through normal attacks. He's still probably my least favorite, as his damage potential didn't end up nearly as high as the other characters, but he did come in clutch in a few fights. I really appreciate how much effort went into giving each character their own mechanics. They're all so much fun to use, especially in boss fights, which were one of my favorite parts of the game. This is where the game's combat shines the most. You're given so much space to set up strategies, and it's incredibly rewarding to see just how high you can get those damage numbers. Every good aspect of the game's combat is made even better during boss fights. There are also grand spectacles that rival most AAA games in terms of both graphics and art direction, and the game continually raises the bar throughout its duration, with each new boss feeling more impressive than the last. We've got a lot of two-phase fights as well, which is super cool. They're also challenging enough that, for the most part, I had to spend at least a little time learning their attack patterns and mechanics. In fact, I wouldn't have minded if the game pushed me a little harder in some cases. There was no fight that I got hard stuck on except for the final super boss, who is significantly more difficult than anything that came before. Excluding that one, I died to the bosses on average like 5 or 6 times, though some may have been a bit less or more, and I think there were a couple I got first try. I think I would have still had fun if that number was closer to 10. I hesitate to say that the game's too easy, since enemy attacks can be very punishing, but the fact that players are able to not only avoid all damage, but deal damage as well during the enemy's turn stacks the deck well into the player's favor. But these mechanics are fun to engage with and are a huge part of the game's identity. I wouldn't want them to be removed. It's worth noting that even the easier fights were still a lot of fun because of how solid the combat mechanics are. I'll put it like this, the game is closer to being too easy than it is to being too hard. However, I can't confidently say that a better balanced version of the game exists. The most challenging parts of the game were when I tried doing a fight that I was clearly underleveled for and I was just being stubborn about it, and that final super boss that I mentioned earlier. Let's talk about equipment. Most of the equipment that you'll find in this game are in the form of these pictos. Pictos have stat benefits, but more importantly, passive perks that can have a drastic effect on the gameplay. The effects range from small things like gaining AP on perfect dodges, to completely busted like being able to play twice in a row or doubling all AP gains. There are hundreds of these things, so I obviously can't go into every single one, but there are a wide variety of strategies available for players to concoct. These perks become available to all party members even without equipping the corresponding picto once 4 battles have been won with the picto equipped, so long as the character has enough Lumina points. This is the most important progression system in Expedition 33. Especially during the later, harder fights, what you choose to spend your Lumina on will have a greater impact on your success than levels or weapon upgrades, but those things are obviously still very important. Each character has only 4 equipment slots, a weapon, and 3 pictos. I appreciate how deceptively complex this approach to equipment is. It's not just about choosing whatever has the bigger number. This is a trap that I think a lot of RPGs fall into. No, when considering a picto, you have to take into account the stats, the perk, and how efficiently it'll allow you to use your Lumina points. There are meaningful decisions to be made in the menus. The game has options for so many different playstyles, whether you're doing a no-hit run, all-hit run, and just about everything in between. I also really like how the game tells you when a passive perk gets activated during the fight. By the end game, you'll see a Star Wars credit crawl's worth of passives going off all at once, and something about that just makes me feel really powerful. The story is another aspect of this game that I think very highly of. Here is your second spoiler warning. My favorite thing about Clair's story is how it was able to subvert my expectations in ways that made sense and didn't feel forced. There's an example of this right at the very start of the game after most of the expedition gets murked by Andy Serkis. Gustav, our protagonist, considers suicide. It's highly unusual in games these days to see a main character in a moment of weakness or mental anguish. A lot of the time, the protagonist has to be Mr. or Mrs. Badass all day, every day, no matter what, and they're completely unfazed by what would be traumatic to most people. This kind of approach can work depending on the game, and it's not even unique to video games, movies do it too, but it's refreshing to see characters that act like humans and not idealized heroes. If you just saw all your friends die before your eyes, you probably wouldn't feel great either. Gustav doesn't act like an archetypical hero in this moment and others, and he's a better character for it. Another example of subverted expectations also involving Gustav, last chance to click off the video if you ignore my spoiler warning, comes with his death at the end of Act 1. Killing off your protagonist 12 hours in is a ballsy move, but it has so much more going for it than shock value. It's here when Gustav is finally acting like a more archetypical hero, defending Mael against impossible odds. But realistically, Renoir gets the upper hand and Gustav is killed off for real. At this point, the story already had me intrigued by all the mysteries it set up. Gustav's death signified that this game wasn't going to pull any punches on an emotional level either, which is great. There's one more moment that I'll single out for praise, the end of Act 2, when it's revealed that the Paintress isn't actually the true villain of the game. This isn't so much subverting expectations, since I kind of saw it coming, but it still works quite well. The reason why a lot of twist villains fail is because sometimes the writers don't bother to make it make sense, and a lot of it ends up feeling like cheap shock value for the sake of it. In Clair Obscur, there are hints as early as the opening hour that the Paintress might not actually be that evil, as noted by Sophie here. And the closer you get to the monolith, note how Verso and Monoko's demeanor become noticeably more withdrawn, and how according to my home screen I'm only 60% of the way through the game. But point is, there are signs that not all is as it seems, which makes the ultimate rug pull feel completely earned. The Paintress, while a flawed character, is not a villainous figure. She's actually the one trying to save the world from her husband, also known as the Curator, also known as the real Renoir, who proceeds to kill everyone after the expedition's apparent victory. What's even more genius is how Renoir also isn't exactly evil. He's just worried that his family is spending too much time in Verso's Animal Crossing village. He views it as an unhealthy and ultimately destructive way to process the grief from Verso's death. The real Verso we're talking about. And Mael's ending heavily implies that his worries aren't unfounded. Of course, players will sympathize more with Mael and the Expeditioners because they are presented as sentient beings and not Animal Crossing villagers, but at the same time, Renoir is aware of this too and clearly takes no pleasure in attempting to erase the canvas. It's just that he's willing to do anything to save his daughter. It's such a complex, nuanced conflict, and it was so well done. Is it better for Mael to live in her quote-unquote fantasy land with all of her friends whilst her body slowly whittles away? Or is it better for her to live as Alicia, in spite of her trauma and disfigurement? There's no easy answer. There aren't any heroes or villains in this game, just flawed people with understandable motivations. Not to mention Verso, a character who spends most of the game lying to and manipulating the rest of the party and makes several questionable moral decisions with shaky justifications. But given everything he's been through, I couldn't help but feel bad for him when all was said and done. It also helps that low-key he was one of my best damage dealers. If you can give me numbers like that, you're on the team. I don't care. I suppose if I had to critique something about this story, then I would have liked to see more attention given to Clair. She is by far the least developed member of the Desandre family, both the real and painted versions of her. I would have liked to see more of what her relationship with Verso was like, but she feels sidelined compared to everyone else. Now, at this point I've glazed the game so much that I might as well be managing a Krispy Kreme. The game does have some problems, but it's nothing all that severe. No game is perfect after all. For one, I think that the level design is one of Expedition 33's weakest aspects. There are still a few things that it does right in this area though, the most obvious being art direction. The levels in this game look absolutely stunning. The environments are so beautiful and surreal, and there's a great amount of visual variety as well. I wasn't exaggerating when I said this game might have the best art direction of any game. Secondly, the combat encounters within the levels are enjoyable more often than not. I've already spoken at length about how strong the combat is, so I don't think I need to elaborate any further. But the enemy variety is solid as well. Most areas have their own set of enemies, which helps keep things fresh. Where Clair falls short is the space in between the combat. In terms of the actual design of these levels, it leaves a little to be desired, especially when compared to other games in this style. The levels are basically linear paths with a few branches here and there that lead to optional loot. The closest comparison I can think of is actually the new God of War games. They both even have the shoot the 3 things to get some loot mechanic. Kind of annoying in both cases, TBH. But anyways, the levels get the job done, but they're nothing exceptional. If you're expecting complex, labyrinthian dungeons to get lost in, then, well, Clair doesn't really have that. In fact, more complex levels might actually make the game worse in its current state. And if you're expecting me to complain about the lack of any sort of map, then yeah, that's exactly what I'm about to do. I know that this decision has its defenders, but for me it just made the levels more annoying to navigate, especially since this is a turn-based game. There were so many instances in which, after an enemy encounter, I would forget where I was going for a second. Maybe this is a me thing, but I found myself getting disoriented quite frequently, which was annoying. It was especially bad in this area, where the gimmick is that everything is just dark as shit, and it was so hard for me to distinguish between where I had and hadn't been yet. And there's platforming. Another thing that this game lacks when compared to other JRPGs is resource management. As I mentioned before, AP does not carry over between fights. HP, on the other hand, does, and you replenish it via these chroma elixirs. Chroma elixirs replenish at rest points like Estus replenishes at bonfires in Dark Souls. Unlike Dark Souls, however, running out of chroma elixirs was almost never an issue. The rest points are rarely that far apart, certainly not far enough that I'd need 5 full heals. A lot of the time there's not even 5 enemies in between rest points, which makes me wonder what the point of this mechanic even was. If my party was automatically healed after every fight, the game really wouldn't be that much different. The only other items you'll have to budget are tints. There are 3 of them: healing, energy, and revive tints. I rarely used these in the first place, aside from revive tints. I was in even less danger of running out of these items than the chroma elixirs. And, strangely, these items can only be used during battle. To heal outside of battle, you have to use chroma elixirs. Even Lune's healing skills cannot be used outside of battle as far as I know. All of this might not be a bad thing depending on what kind of player you are. If you're the kind of gamer who just wants to vibe out to the amazing visuals and not have to worry about item management and engage with enemies on your own terms, then this setup will probably work for you. As for myself, I'm not quite sure how I feel about how segregated combat and level exploration are. In other JRPGs, such as Atlus's Persona series, or my other favorite turn-based game, Metaphor ReFantasio, resource management is an important part of the gameplay loop. You have to manage your money, items, MP, everything. The decisions you make during battle will have implications in the dungeon crawling. The calendar system incentivizes players to do things as efficiently as possible. This is an aspect of the game that I find to be pretty enjoyable. The upside to Expedition 33's approach is that you'll be able to use high-cost skills as often as you want, but there is something to be said for other RPGs' strategic approach to level progression. It's not necessarily better or worse, just different. During my playthrough, the game received an update that allows players to retry after losing a battle. Previously, you just went back to your last autosave, which was pretty much always just the last item you picked up. I think this change was for the better. It's clear that the levels weren't supposed to be the main source of difficulty, so this choice is in line with that. They saved all the challenge for when you're actually in combat. Overall, I wouldn't say Expedition 33 has bad level design, it's just that I've seen better in this style of game. I've got a couple more nitpicks before one last major bit of criticism. This volleyball minigame is so awful that I almost believe it's bad on purpose as some kind of misguided homage to Final Fantasy X and that game's terrible minigames. There's a very large delay in between pressing the button and the action occurring on screen, which makes learning the correct timing very unintuitive. Also, the camera is so far back that it's hard to tell what direction my character is facing at any given moment. I don't understand why they opted for this when the game has a perfectly fine parry-oriented combat system. The rage bait platforming sections are also trash. Platforming in general is a puzzling inclusion. I swear there's a slight delay in between pressing the jump button and my character actually jumping. This led to many instances where my guy just careened off the edge like a dumbass. Very annoying. I eventually learned to avoid these gestural beaches like the plague, so hopefully there wasn't anything important hidden in one of the ones I missed. My last major problem with the game is that I'm not a fan of how Act 3 is structured. After the Paintress is defeated and we go through the whole mindfuck plot twist song and dance, the game opens up substantially. With SKA's new flying ability, hours and hours of new content opens up. The game also gives you the option to head straight to the final boss. At this point I had a bit of a dilemma. I'm the kind of player who likes to see all or most of a game's content before rolling credits. However, I didn't want to accidentally overpower myself and ruin the finale of the game by making it too easy. So, reluctantly, for the first and only time during my playthrough, I did the unthinkable. I consulted Reddit. The consensus seemed to be that fighting the final boss as early as possible was the way to go. I did just that, and the final boss felt appropriately balanced compared to the other fights. I'm glad I fought him this way, but for me at least, the finale of the game was undercut because I knew I wasn't even close to being done. There are so many new areas that open up in Act 3, but I couldn't do all of them because I didn't want to make myself overpowered. And so the final boss and ending didn't hit me as hard as it could have. Knowing how much content was left made it so that I couldn't view the ending as the actual end of the game. For what it's worth, I did like the ending and the final boss was really cool, I just wish that the endgame was structured differently. A lot of Act 3's content could have and should have been woven into the main narrative somehow. The Reacher event, for instance, definitely should have been in the main quest. There's important shit here, like the death of Painted Alicia, and afterwards the reveal that Verso intentionally let Gustav die. It doesn't feel right that I'm learning this information after I've rolled credits. There are two potential reasons I can think of as to why Act 3 is the way it is. First, maybe the devs were concerned about making the game too long, so they gave players the option to end the game early. Secondly, they may have been worried about pacing and going too long without any narrative progression. But since Act 2 ended with such a massive lore dump, I think having more character-focused content in lieu of plot progression would have been acceptable. And as we've discussed, there are important developments and revelations that would have functioned better if it was part of the main quest. Whatever the case may be, Act 3 was the least compelling part of the game for me, and not just because of the structural issues. Act 3 also sees the game reuse enemies a lot, which is something that the game had been really good at avoiding up until this point. The Ice and Fire Swordsmen, the Gestural Robots, Burgions, hell, even bosses get reused multiple times. The Flying Manor level is basically a greatest hits compilation for the entire game, where you get to fight the Ice Titan, Evereek, Goguls, and Duel East again. And then there's the Endless Tower, where you can fight them again. I know that this area is optional, but for me it felt like a necessity since the level curve was so steep. There's still fun to be had during this part of the game since the combat is so strong, but it's weaker compared to the rest of the game. With a weaker narrative hook, and with the constant reuse of enemies and bosses, Act 3 falls a bit short. It was worth seeing through to the end though, because the final superboss was pretty great. Simon has some really great build-up, and is the only truly difficult boss in the game. Here, the game's combat system gets pushed to its limit. He has the most elaborate combos out of any enemy, a very large health pool, he can bring any party member down to 1 HP with no way to avoid damage, he absorbs shields, and he can permanently remove KO'd party members from the fight. It's very overwhelming and it seemed impossible at first, but like with all the other enemies, simply learning the attack patterns will get you to victory. The game also gives you some pretty overpowered abilities of your own in the form of Pictos, but it still felt balanced due to how insane the fight is. I struggled pretty hard on this guy even with 3 cheaters and 2 Clay as life users. Second Chance and Survivor also felt outright necessary. Really liked learning this one. Though the move where he just murders the entire expedition with no way to avoid it was kind of bullshit. I don't like that one. I decided to skip phase 3 entirely by dealing 19 million damage at once, thank you CL. Great fight overall, and I'm glad we could end on a high note, since I think very highly of this game. This will probably end up being my game of the year, but I guess we'll see how Silksong and Prime 4 turn out. In any case, Expedition 33 is a masterpiece and one of the finest RPGs ever created. I'm sure you didn't need me to tell you that, but that's how good it is. No hot takes here, it's just that the game is so good I had to spend time talking about it. Thanks for watching. All this to say, I just love video games that have somber piano pieces on the home screen. That's my favorite genre of game.